My name is David Miller. I'm from Toronto, and I'm here to help you. I have used that line before. It always gets the same response. What I want to talk about today is resilience from the perspective of the environment. And it's our perspective at the World Wildlife Fund Canada that we can address our environmental challenges, but we can only do it in a sustainable, resilient way if we look at the environment and people. If you meet the needs of people socially and economically while respecting your environment, you will have a truly resilient and long-standing solution. And we call that demonstrating the possible. And this is very urgent. We did a study released in 2014 at WWF that showed that 52% of the world's wildlife has disappeared since the 1970s. More than half of the populations of all of the species in the world has disappeared since the 1970s. That's an incredibly daunting figure, and it's because of human activity, often economic activity because of pollution and other stressors. We also know, because of climate change, we see an increasing frequency and severity of storms. For example, the ice storm in Toronto and the very serious floods in Calgary, and many, many other weather-related problems and challenges. These are extremely serious challenges, and to be resilient, it means understanding these challenges, predicting them, and working with nature in a way that understands human needs and producing long-term permanent solutions. This is the South Saskatchewan River, and by the way, I went for a little walk today, and it's absolutely beautiful along the river in Saskatoon. I thought it was fabulous. But that's not why the slide's here, although I think it's a beautiful view. The slide's here because WWF Canada is doing studies of all of the watersheds across Canada, and we recently released our threats assessment on the South Saskatchewan River. A threats assessment assesses the risks to a watershed. And the risks to the South Saskatchewan River are actually quite high. And if we're going to be resilient, we need to start looking at those threats and addressing them, because they're stressing the river. They're threats like pollution. They're threats like overuse of water from agriculture and from people and from growing populations. They're threats like habitat fragmentation from dams and from railways and roads. Very significant threats. And we need to start thinking about that today and addressing those challenges because we know what happens when we don't respect nature and we don't listen to the early signals. And we know that from many, many things, but particularly from the Newfoundland cod fishery. This is a picture of a small village in Newfoundland that I was in a month ago named Bédaverde. In Bédaverde, people made a living off the cod fishery for nearly 500 years until 1992. When, because of overfishing, the fishery was closed because nature couldn't sustain the cod anymore. 500 years of a fishery closed overnight. 40,000 people lost their jobs in the Maritimes within a month. It's the largest mass layoff in Canadian history. The fishing boats were sidelined. WWF is now working with the fishing industry in Newfoundland and the Farm Fish and Allied Workers Union and the government of Newfoundland, as the cod is showing signs of recovery, to change our habits and help that fishery come back based on principles of sustainability, which involves science, analysis of fishing techniques, all sorts of things. And it's incredibly encouraging that this movement is led by the fish harvesters, the very people who are devastated economically by nature's collapse, who now understand and lead on the idea that we have to respect nature if our human economic and social systems are going to survive. It's another example I'm familiar with in Toronto that combines these principles of environmental sustainability with social sustainability and economic sustainability. And that's the revitalization of Regent Park. For those who don't know, Regent Park was one of Canada's first low-income housing developments. It was built to house soldiers after World War II and eventually became rent-geared to income for the general public. And Regent Park was a little bit unfortunate because the thinking at the time was, let's cut this neighborhood off from all the neighborhoods around it and make it a green, bucolic place. Well, of course, what happens when you isolate a neighborhood? based on economic class is the neighborhood turns inward and becomes very isolated. And by the year 2000, it had become a neighborhood full of challenges with an aging housing stock that needed to be revitalized. So the first thing that happened in that revitalization was that the City of Toronto went and actually spoke to the people who lived there and said, we need to rebuild your housing stock. What do you want? And it was fascinating when the people were given a chance to have a say what they said. The first thing they said was a grocery store. Because in their low-income neighborhood, like most low-income neighborhoods, there actually wasn't a grocery store, and it was more expensive to buy groceries than it would be in a middle or high-income neighborhood. The second thing they said, you might be able to guess. It's a famous Canadian restaurant. Tim Hortons, yes. And the third thing was a bank, and I must say the Royal Bank of Canada stepped up and they now have a bank, because like many low-income neighborhoods, they didn't have a bank. They also said some other interesting things. They wanted high environmental standards, and the revitalization was done in a way that met very high environmental standards, particularly with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and reducing our footprint on the planet. They also wanted a neighborhood where if they got a better job, they could stay. So they wanted middle-income housing, not just rent-geared to income housing. And the final thing they wanted was economic resilience. They said if the City of Toronto is going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild our community, we want our children to have an opportunity to get the benefit of that investment by getting jobs directly working on these projects. And the City of Toronto put a clause in the construction contracts that every contractor had to have at least 25% of the jobs be local residents. Now I can tell you, when the contractors first got that, they weren't too happy, because they hadn't done it before. But I spoke to one of the contractors at a groundbreaking for one of the buildings, and he said, you know, Mr. Miller, I thought you were crazy, but this is actually the best thing we've ever done. My employees all love it, and sometimes a little bit hard to bring the skills along of these young people who haven't been trained, but they learn and they grow, and it's the best thing we've ever done. So what that community had was true resilience. They lived in buildings designed to the highest environmental standards and a low impact, a low footprint from a carbon perspective on the city. They lived in a community that had been renewed, its green space had been renewed with respect to nature. And they lived in a community where the wealth was shared in a way that created shared prosperity. And no matter what knocks come along to Regent Park, they're going to be much more likely to withstand them because they've met the environmental, economic, and social sustainability tests that ensure true resilience. Now, the World Wildlife Fund Canada, we concern ourselves with nature in Canada's most iconic places. This is a polar bear. The polar bear's habitat today is threatened by climate change. The amount of sea ice is decreasing dramatically because the sea ice season is shorter because global warming hits the Arctic more strongly. It's not just threatening the polar bear. It's threatening the livelihoods of the Inuit people and others who depend on the richness of the sea ice to hunt and fish. The area along the edge of the sea ice is incredibly rich. So it affects the economic and social conditions of the Arctic as well as the polar bear. And if we don't want the crack in that photo to spread too wide, we all have to take collective action. And I called these remarks demonstrating the possible, because I know when the cod fishery in Newfoundland is certified as sustainable, and when young people in Regent Park in Toronto, one of the poorest neighborhoods in that city, have equal economic opportunity to young people who grow up in other neighborhoods, the people will see those changes and will understand that there actually is hope, that if we do the right things, we can create an environmentally sustainable and resilient future. And that's the message I wanted to bring tonight, that we can do these things, that there are examples of true resilience where we've met our environmental goals, our social goals, and our economic goals. It is possible, and we should hope. Thank you very much.